Hello everyone, welcome back to week 1 of English 2303. As I promised, I want to talk a little bit more about the bigger question of what is Romanticism? What is this course actually going to be about? And before I start, I just want to emphasize that I'm not going to do a lot of long lectures in this course. This is the longest I'm going to speak at one sitting, but there are a number of items I really want to cover in order to give you some of the important context for this course. So this will be a bit of a longer lecture. So I want to start by giving you a sense of what Romanticism is all about, but I also want to emphasize that one of the main points I'm going to be making here is that all of these are limited generalizations. There's no one definition of the term that's going to cover everything that we're going to study in this course. So Romanticism then is a highly contentious and problematic term, so it's one that I'm going to help you try to unpack in a useful way today. But before I get into the vexed question of what is Romanticism, I'd like to raise the surprisingly difficult question of when was Romanticism? Depending on what texts you read, you'll come across a number of different possible answers to this question. In the course outline, I've suggested 1789 to 1837, and I've done this to basically give us the broadest possible scope for this course, but there is not wide agreement on this point. So to start with, I'm proposing 3 possible answers to this question. Number 1, we could say that Romanticism spans the period from 1789 to 1832. This would be an obvious political division in the period. 1789 marks the beginning of the French Revolution, while 1832 is the period of the Reform Bill in England, which granted more political rights to members of the lower classes. So one of the significant features of this period is indeed its revolutionary thinking. So this attempt to challenge and overthrow the old established order is prevalent throughout. And we can see that this erupts with a great deal of violence in France in 1789 and largely subsides in 1832. So insofar as Romanticism is a political phenomenon, we might say that it spanned this period from 1789 to 1832. It represents a period of discord that is largely resolved with the return to good middle-class values in the Victorian period. But Romanticism was by no means a strictly political movement. As we shall see, the term is generally more specifically restricted to the literary and artistic movements that period spawned. So from this point of view, another way to define the period would be to say that it spans a more limited period, say 1798 to 1824. That in this way we can identify it as beginning with the first major outpouring of Romantic writing and ending with the deaths and or changing aesthetic views of its major figures. 1798 was arguably the first really Romantic year in literary terms. Most significantly, Wordsworth and Coleridge co-published a volume called Lyrical Ballads, which purported to be an entirely new approach to poetry. So we might say that in some ways signals the beginning of the Romantic period. On the other end of the scale, Keats died of tuberculosis in 1821, Shelley drowned in 1822, Byron died in Greece fighting for Greek independence in 1824, and by this time Wordsworth and Coleridge had become politically conservative figures, were not writing as they used to do. So none of the poets that are commonly identified as major Romantic poets were really productive after this point. So we could say that as a movement, Romanticism was over by 1824, if not before. But then there were also other poets writing. It's not as if these guys died and suddenly there were no poets left in the world. And finally, we might, for the sake of convenience, simply define the Romantic period as 1801 to 1837. And this is as if to say that all periodizations are arbitrary anyway, so we might as well use round numbers to make it easier to refer to. After all, if there's a course on literature of the 18th century and there's a course on Victorian literature, the Romantic period has to fit in between those two periods. 1837 was the year that Queen Victoria took over the throne of England, in which many see as symbolic of the changing tone of the century from unrest and revolution to a more stable set of practical middle-class values. And this is not entirely satisfactory, since many of the works we'll be studying were written in the last decade of the 18th century. But it does have the advantage of not claiming an absolute start and end point, which can't possibly be sustained by the facts. In short, then, I encourage you to be aware that there are no hard and fast rules for when this period, or really any literary period, starts and ends. There are a whole range of factors that influence the ideas of the period, from political to historical to social to literary to technological factors. These periods are not straight lines, but a continuum that's being shaped in many different ways. So if you liked my fuzzy answer to that question, you're going to love my answer to the much more difficult question of what is Romanticism? To start with the basic definition of the term, it's important to note that the word romantic meant something very different in the 18th and 19th centuries than it does now. When we hear romantic, we think specifically of intimate relationships based on love. We moderns only have romantic feelings for our partners. But at this time, the word referred more generally to feelings of all kinds. Any kind of sensitivity or affection for others, or for the world in general, could be considered romantic. So, initially, many uses of this term were actually quite negative. Romantic often referred to an excess of feeling, people who let their emotions overpower their better judgment. Even among the writers we're studying, we'll see this kind of use of the word. If they were romantic, they weren't always proud of it, and they were very often conflicted between appealing to the feelings and making rational judgments and arguments based on the intellect, trying to combine the two. So the immediate source of the term Romanticism comes from its association with the earlier literary form of romance, a poetic form associated with medieval times and the archaic conventions of chivalry, the world of knights, ladies, and dragons. So again, there are negative connotations here in the 18th century, which privileged a style of art that's emphasized order and regularity and the forward progress of history. Writing in the Romantic period, by contrast, was often characterized by its irregularity and wildness and often archaic form and content. So from an 18th century point of view, Romantic writing might have seemed like a return to a more primitive form of art. So being romantic was something that had often been portrayed as a negative quality. So many of the poets we're looking at struggle to reevaluate the value of the feelings. Is there a way in which feelings are in fact more positive forces? It's also important to note that these poets did not call themselves romantic. This was a label applied to them by critics in the Victorian period looking back on these writers, and not always in an admiring way. So when you come across the word romantic in the poems on this course, take note of how it's used and what it's being used to mean. You'll find that it's used in a number of different ways and valued in very different ways as well. But the bottom line here is, even if they didn't call themselves romantic, we might see these poets as trying to rehabilitate the idea of what it means to be romantic, of giving a new importance to the feelings that they had not been given before. But it must also be emphasized that this was an endeavor confined to a select few poets, many of whom disagreed with each other about the specifics of aesthetics anyway. So the first reason I want to raise the question, what is Romanticism, is that many scholars now object to the use of the label altogether because it refers more to a set of ideas held only by certain people and did not exactly define its entire historical time period. If we refer to this period as the Romantic period, doesn't this imply that it's a movement that affected the whole of the people and not just a handful of poets who were not entirely representative of the people as a whole? For example, when I took a course very similar to this one 25 years ago, almost the whole course was taken up by what are often referred to as the Big Six Romantic poets: William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. They're all men, they're all white. Byron and Shelley were born into the lower aristocracy. Wordsworth had a wealthy patron. The others were a bit more middle class, but even Blake and Coleridge also benefited from patronage. Keats was really the only one of the six who ever had significant money troubles. So not exactly widely representative. What about the working classes? What about women? Their experiences clearly corresponded much less to the aesthetic ideas of Romanticism. It's also worth mentioning that when I studied Romanticism, I also read 3 novels, all of which were written by women. So gender is also a factor in the reception of the period. Women's writing was considered more acceptable when it was seen to be commercial rather than artistic in nature. Moreover, since Romanticism is a retroactive definition created by critics in later years to describe that period, we also have to be aware of the biases that inform those critics, who generally placed much less value on the feelings, the Victorians especially. So it's a term then that implies a certain coherence to the project of Romanticism, as if it were a unified movement. And while there were some significant collaborations and connections between poets in this period, it would be false to suppose that all these poets even knew each other. Wordsworth and Coleridge were close friends and published lyrical ballads together. Byron and Percy Shelley were friends and made a bit of a literary circle along with Shelley's wife Mary and Byron's doctor John Polidori, who were the authors of, in Mary Shelley's case, Frankenstein, and in Polidori's case, the first vampire novel in English. But in general, the poets we're studying were working in very different contexts in different times and places. So keeping in mind that this definition of Romanticism is one that we will investigate and question further throughout the course, I will start by giving this the standard account of literary history, and throughout the course we will add layers of complexity to it. So let's start by turning our attention to the standard definition of Romanticism, which tends to focus more or less on these 6 key points. Number 1, the concept of the poet and the poem. Poetry moves from being considered in the 18th century an objective art to something that is very subjective, lyrical, and personal. So here we have the Romantic revaluation of the lyric poem, which we will get into in this course. Number 2, the importance of feeling or sensibility. Poetry is not, as in the 18th century, thought through or crafted, but its origin and value comes from personal feeling. It's often in the form of effusion or spontaneous sounding verse. Number 3, the value of nature. The natural world is not only idealized, but encountered on a profound intersubjective level. The poet is a child of nature. Nature is a human-like force. Number 4, the glorification of the ordinary. Poetry didn't have to be about grand mythical events or important historical actions. It could find its origins in the humble life of the people. Number 5, the supernatural, romance, and psychological extremes. Poetry could involve fantasy connected with the mode of the Gothic. The imagination in this period had much freer reign. And number 6, individualism and alienation. The feelings that inspire poetry are very often the product of an individual who feels cut off from the social world. The Romantics represented themselves as loners, whether they actually were or not. So, as we'll see, these rather general 6 aspects of a definition of Romanticism apply to some, but rarely to all of the poets that we're going to study at the same time. And in many cases, we can also see how these qualities of Romanticism might be contradictory. For example, how can you glorify the ordinary while writing about the supernatural? Or how can one feel a profound connection with nature when one defines oneself as an individual to the exclusion of anything outside the self? So again, we have to be careful about overgeneralizing the period, although this list at least gives us a useful place to start in terms of thinking about what Romanticism is all about. One of the threads that connects many of these romantic qualities is the desire to harness a power that exceeds the limits of the rational human mind. And we'll see this approach to the unknowable in many of the poets of the period. Moreover, it's important to note that most of these principles emerge very much in opposition to the claims made for poetry and art in general in the 18th century. Just to review those 6 points. Number 1, the poet in the Romantic period is conceived of as an imaginative genius rather than one who laboriously constructs verses. Someone who is imaginative rather than simply a hard worker. Romantic poetry is, or at least is supposed to seem, more spontaneous, originating in the poet's feelings. The 18th century saw poetry as work. Poems were crafted by the intellect of great poets. The Romantic period sees poetry more as the product of the feelings. And so hence number 2, feelings are valued more than reason or logic. William Blake, for example, took issue with Sir Joshua Reynolds, one of the most important painters in England in the late 18th century. Reynolds said that if you're painting a tree, you should strive to paint what is universal about that tree, its tree-ness, if you will. But for Blake, what is important is the particular tree that you're seeing. And he put it very simply, to generalize is to be an idiot. Moreover, the tree that one artist sees might not look the same to another artist. For Blake and other writers of the period, the personal vision is unique and not reducible to some overall objective universal vision. The point is here that subjective feelings about a thing matter more than the objective reality of the thing being described. Number 3, nature is a subjective experience, not an objective law. Nature, in particular, is seen is not seen as the set of laws governing human conduct, but the feeling of connection with the surrounding world. Number 4, literature does not need to be about lofty ideals. The 18th century tended to value the heroic mode, epic, tragedy, literature about great mythological figures. The Romantics sought to see value in everything, so writing about ordinary people enabled them to show this. Number 5, the irrational challenges the supremacy of reason. If the 18th century is all about the principles of enlightenment and reason, the Romantic period pushes back against this and shows what happens when the feelings are repressed and leads to somewhat more of a celebration of the irrational. Number 6, individuals do not need to be bound by the limitations of the past. They can create their own future. Politically, there was a feeling the old order had failed, that it was up to the new generation to put things right. And this comes across in much of the poetry as well. So the implication is that the Age of Enlightenment didn't have all the answers, since it tried to see art as something calculable, part of a system. Romantic writers such as Coleridge wanted to see art as organic rather than mechanical, something that is grown rather than made, something that is personal rather than universal. So in all of these points, the Romantic writers are reacting against the writers that came before them. I want to take note of a few other important historical developments for Romantic poetry. Number one, the rise of the novel. The 18th century had seen the rise of the novel and a new value placed on realism. Novels were generally modern and historically specific. They are opposed to and privileged over romance, which was fanciful and set in the past. Novels were more realistic and therefore, according to the moralists of the time, capable of depicting good examples. That by representing good characters in novels, we can learn how to be good ourselves. Romance, on the other hand, was seen as pure fantasy and therefore dangerous, capable of eroding the distinction between reality and fantasy. Just as today we see accusations of the corrupting influence of video games or movies. Of course, in this period, these concerns were very often applied mostly to women and young people, although there is ample evidence that men read romances too. Often it was said that this was a strictly female genre, although that's not entirely true. So the Romantic poets come along and react against this realistic view of art as a reflection of mundane urban reality. Romantic poetry tends to be more psychological, more concerned with the inner emotional life than with the exterior world. And of course, more interested in nature than the world of the city. So Romantic poetry is, if it's realist in a subjective internal sense rather than objective external sense. And instead of idealizing examples of good moral conduct, they favored more transgressive figures, such as Prometheus from Greek myth, for example, because they envisaged fighting for something better than the current situation. Moreover, lyric poetry in general focuses on the subjective experience, again challenging the Enlightenment's privileging of objectivity and novelistic realism. Number two, the French Revolution. Obviously, this is primarily an event in French history, but it had important repercussions for England. Initially, there was a great deal of enthusiasm for the event in England, and oppressed people had risen up, overthrown their rulers, and sought to improve their condition in life. If France could be improved in this way, why not England? Democratic ideals thus started to take hold, and the idea that the people might be able to control their own lives began to seem possible. Of course, there was very much a division in England between those who thought this way, who were often referred to as Jacobins, because the French Revolutionary Party was called the Jacobins. And on the other hand, the conservatives and the very rich, who were doing quite well with things as they were. So there were wars of words, and in some cases actual violence, as the English authorities realized they would have to clamp down on dissension if they were going to stay in power. Gradually, enthusiasm for the French Revolution waned as England saw that the revolutionary rulers had become just as bloodthirsty and oppressive as the tyrants they had replaced. What's called the Reign of Terror caused many English radicals to question whether revolution really was the answer. So in England, the French Revolution became a kind of political lesson. Many saw some good ideas in it, but felt that they'd been carried out badly. Many Romantic poets thus wrote revolutionary poems about changing the world. but were often wary of violence. Another effect, which I'll talk more about in later classes, is an increasing amount of violence and sensationalism in novels. How can you shock and engage people when reality has become more violent and horrific than fiction? Obviously, for some writers, the solution was to go further over the top. Just as some people say that violence on TV and in movies today has increased because we've become so desensitized to it. So we can see that in the popularity of the Gothic novel in this period. So we will see that the poets often justify their art as being something different from and better than the excesses of the novels of the period. And finally, another important consequence of the French Revolution is an increasing suspicion of foreign influences in England. It's always foreigners who are held responsible for the importation of revolutionary ideas. And as the revolution gives way to the rule of Napoleon in France, England eventually went to war with France, giving rise to even more suspicion. In short, many writers of this period looked at France in particular as a source of wonder, but also with suspicion. It embodied great possibilities in the Revolution and in Napoleon, who is very much another romantic icon, in that he's a transgressive and revolutionary figure whose ultimate defeat spelled triumph for the old order, even as England was very much influential in that defeat. So we'll also see this to be an important concern in the works we study. How to define what it means to be English, how to distance this Englishness from the French and German and even Italian and Spanish. Number three, and another important context for many of the texts we'll look at, is the Industrial Revolution. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw an increasing shift away from an agricultural economy towards an industrial, mercantile one. This is one reason for the importance of nature to the Romantic poets. They idealize a simple world that is starting to disappear. There's also a great deal of nostalgia in general in the poetry of the age. While 18th century writers felt that history was moving forward, the Romantics are more sensible of something important that is being lost with this progress. Another important point is the changing treatment of class. The aristocratic feudal system whereby the nobility owned the land and shared a reciprocal relationship with the peasants is starting to be replaced by a middle-class economy where all relationships are based on money. So the question of inherent merit often comes up in Romantic texts. Are certain people better than others because of the blood that happens to run in their veins? Conservatives and aristocrats would say yes. On the other hand, are virtue and individual merit the right way to measure a person? This would be the position of the new middle class, who see social climbing as something that is possible. And acknowledging that these issues of class may seem somewhat foreign to us now, but it's important to realize that these texts were being written at a time when long-held beliefs about class were only just starting to be challenged. Similar problems arise when looking at gender relations. From a modern perspective, many of these texts will appear very archaic in their treatment of women, but again, they were written at a time when a rising awareness of the need for women's rights was just starting to emerge. Gender will be a particularly important issue throughout this course. As I mentioned, Romanticism has largely been seen as an exclusively male movement, but there were many significant women writers working in the period as well. Unlike earlier periods, it wasn't really shocking when women wrote, but there were still unspoken limitations placed on their writing. For example, Anne Radcliffe was the best-selling novelist of the 1790s. Jane Austen was very successful in the 1810s. But on the other hand, female poets were rarely taken seriously as poets. Joanna Baillie, for example, whom Sir Walter Scott called the female Shakespeare, actually had a great deal of difficulty getting her plays performed on the stage of the time. and as a respectable middle-class lady was unable to push more strongly for their performance. It's as if women's writing could be tolerated only as long as they were seen to be in it for the money. Women with pretensions to being great writers were much less warmly received in this period. And the women who did write poetry had to be careful in terms of how they position themselves with relation to their male romantic counterparts. Women have so long been disparaged as being governed by feeling rather than rationality. So writing romantic poetry like Wordsworth's was often taken as a sign of conventionally feminine weakness. So from our contemporary perspective, we need to think about how gender is shaped by these cultural assumptions and expectations, as well as how that shaping is contested or reworked in interesting ways by the female writers of the period. All this is meant to explain certain things about the way in which I've chosen to organize this course. Instead of focusing on the so-called Big Six, as I did 25 years ago, we're going to be reading the work of 16 different poets, 8 male poets, 8 female poets. And I would emphasize that this is not historical revisionism on my part. In many cases, these women were more famous at the time than their male counterparts. But were neglected by later literary criticism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, of the Big Six, only Byron was really a best-selling author during the Romantic period. Wordsworth became popular later in his lifetime. Coleridge was better known as an essayist and critic. Shelley and Keats were upheld as icons only after their untimely deaths, and Blake remained very much an obscure figure until his rediscovery in the late 19th century. By contrast, Joanna Baillie, as I mentioned, was referred to in her own time as the female Shakespeare. Letitia Elizabeth Landon was one of the first real literary celebrities in England, after perhaps only Byron. So one thing that I really want this course to show is the breadth of different kinds of writing that took place in this period. And one of the ways I'm doing that is that I've organized the weeks around topics rather than authors. This is designed to show the range of writing and to decenter this idea of the author as being the focus of the course. Most importantly, Romanticism will be seen as a term to question and explore. It's not simply the answer we have from the beginning as a way of explaining all the poems that we read. We're going to have to reevaluate this term constantly and think about what it means and how it works. In short, then, what I've tried to outline today is some of the answers to the question of what is Romanticism in terms of some of its major ideas about art, imagination, genius, particularity, nature, revolution, and so on. I also want to emphasize that these are all generalizations, that none of them can adequately account for the period as a whole. So we'll have to look critically at each of them and consider how each embodies and shapes these concepts. And in order to do that, we'll have to start looking at the poems. We start next week with one of the hallmarks of Romantic poetry, poems about animals and nature. So start by reading the poems on the syllabus, and I'll talk to you about those poems again next week.